May 14, 1940, 1:22 p.m. The sky over Rotterdam filled with the roar of engines. Residents looked up and saw an ominous sight. Dozens of German Heinkel He-111 bombers flying in tight formation. Many still hoped it was a passing squadron heading for another target, but their hopes were dashed. At 1:27 p.m., the first bombs fell on the city center. A bombing raid had begun that, within 15 minutes, would reduce the second-largest city in the Netherlands to burning ruins. Between 90 and 100 bombers, according to various sources, participated in the raid. Of these, between 57 and 66 aircraft managed to drop their payloads on the city. A total of approximately 97 tons of bombs were dropped. 158 large, 250 kilos high explosive bombs, and 1,150 small 50-kilo incendiary bombs. The bombs fell primarily on the city center, residential areas, shopping streets, the port, and warehouses. Within minutes, the center of Rotterdam was transformed into a fiery inferno. High explosive bombs destroyed buildings, pierced roofs, and created rubble. Incendiary bombs ignited everything that could burn. Rotterdam was an old city. Many buildings in the center were built in the 16th and 17th centuries, made of wood and brick. They burned quickly and fiercely. The fire spread from house to house, from block to block. Fire crews were helpless. Too many fires, too little water, too strong a wind. By evening, the city center was a complete conflagration. The human losses were tragic. According to official figures, approximately 800–900 people died. The exact figures vary, from 814 to 884 according to different sources. More than 80,000 residents of the city's 620,000 population were left homeless. It was a catastrophic blow for a small city. The area of destruction amounted to 2.5–2.6 square kilometers. Virtually the entire historic center of Rotterdam was destroyed. The material losses were enormous. 24,978 homes, 2,320 stores, 775 warehouses, 62 schools, and 24 churches were destroyed. Entire neighborhoods disappeared. The working-class districts of Bospa and Toos-Endiken, shopping streets, and port warehouses. The famous 15th-century church of St. Lawrence, Groot of St. Lawrencekerk, was seriously damaged, though its stone walls remained standing. Many other historic buildings were razed to the ground. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the numbers, but the speed. 15 minutes. That's all it took to destroy the heart of a city that had existed for 600 years. 15 minutes decided the fate not only of Rotterdam, but of all of the Netherlands. Because that evening, the Dutch government capitulated. Queen Wilhelmina evacuated to London. A country that had resisted the German invasion for 5 days was broken by a single airstrike. The bombing of Rotterdam became a symbol of a new type of warfare, total war, where civilians become the target. Until this point in World War II, air raids had been used primarily to support ground troops or to attack military installations. Rotterdam became the first major European city to be deliberately destroyed from the air for the political purpose of forcing surrender. This was a precedent that paved the way for Coventry, London, Dresden, Tokyo, and Hiroshima. The German command later claimed the bombing was a military necessity, that the city was a fortified point, and that the Dutch troops refused to surrender. But the facts told a different story. Most of the bombs fell on residential areas, not military targets. Surrender negotiations were still underway when the bombers received the order to take off. There was an attempt to call off the raid at the last minute, but some of the crews did not receive the cancellation signal. This was either a mistake or a deliberate disregard. The international community was shocked. Newspapers around the world wrote about aerial terror, barbarity, and crimes against humanity. But this did not stop the escalation of the air war. Rotterdam became the first in a long line of cities to be devastated from the air over the next 5 years. War had changed. The lines between front and rear, between soldiers and civilians, had blurred. Cities became battlefields. For the residents of Rotterdam, May 14th, 1940, became the day that divided their lives into before and after. Before the bombing, Rotterdam was a thriving trading city with a rich history, beautiful architecture, and a vibrant culture. Afterward, it was ruins, ashes, and memory. Many never returned to the city. Those who remained had to build a new Rotterdam on the bones of the old. Today, more than 80 years later, Rotterdam has been completely restored. It is a modern city with cutting-edge architecture, one of Europe's largest ports. But the memory of May 14th lives on. Every year, memorial ceremonies are held on this day. In the city center stands the monument, The Destroyed City, De Verwoeste Stad, by sculptor Osip Zadkine, a distorted figure of a man with a hole in his heart, his arms raised to the sky in a silent scream. This is the scream of Rotterdam, the scream of a city that lost its heart in 15 minutes. May 10, 1940, 3:55 a.m. Germany launched Operation Weserübung, Fall Gelb, the invasion of the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. This was the first stage of a broader plan to conquer France. The Netherlands was a neutral country that had not participated in the First World War and hoped to remain neutral in the Second. But for Germany, Dutch neutrality was irrelevant. The Netherlands was an obstacle to France, and this obstacle had to be removed. The German plan was daring and innovative. Instead of a frontal assault, as in World War I, the Germans employed a combined attack using paratroopers, glider pilots, and mechanized columns. The goal was to capture key bridges over rivers and canals before the Dutch could blow them up. Once the bridges were captured, German tank divisions would be able to quickly break through into the interior of the country. At 3:55 a.m., German planes crossed the border. Paratroopers landed near key bridges. Glider pilots captured airfields. Tank columns invaded from the east. The Dutch army was caught completely by surprise. It had about 280,000 men under arms, but was poorly armed and trained. The Netherlands had no tanks, little artillery, and an outdated air force. The country was unprepared for modern warfare. Nevertheless, the Dutch resisted desperately. They blew up many bridges, slowing the German advance. They flooded low-lying areas, creating water obstacles. They fought for every town, every village. The German command expected the Netherlands to capitulate within a day, but a day passed, then a second, a third, and the Dutch were still fighting. Rotterdam became a key point of resistance. It was the second largest city in the Netherlands, with a population of approximately 620,000, and the country's largest port. The city straddled both banks of the Meuse River. Several bridges across the river connected the northern and southern parts of the city. These bridges were critical to the German advance. If the Germans captured them, they could break through to Fortress Holland, the central fortified region of the country, home to Amsterdam, The Hague, and Utrecht. On May 10th, German paratroopers attempted to seize the bridges over the Meuse. They succeeded in capturing the southern ends of the bridges, but Dutch troops held the northern ends. Fierce fighting ensued. The Dutch counterattacked, attempting to dislodge the Germans from the bridges. The Germans fought back, awaiting reinforcements. The situation reached a stalemate. On May 11-12, German mechanized units broke through to Rotterdam from the south. The Germans now controlled the southern part of the city and the bridges, but the Dutch held the northern part. The city became a front line. Street fighting raged in the port districts. Snipers fired from rooftops. Machine gun crews took up positions at intersections. Civilians hid in basements. On May 13th, the German command decided it was time to end the war. The Netherlands had resisted longer than expected. The plan to invade France was behind schedule. The Dutch capitulation had to be expedited at any cost. Colonel General Kurt Student, commander of the airborne forces, proposed using air power to force Rotterdam to capitulate. The idea was simple and brutal. If the Dutch did not surrender voluntarily, the city would be destroyed from the air. Not military targets, but the city itself, residential areas, shopping streets, the port. This was intended to break the will to resist. The German High Command approved the plan. An ultimatum was sent to the Dutch authorities: surrender by 1:20 p.m. on May 14th, or Rotterdam would be destroyed. And if Rotterdam did not capitulate, the next target would be Utrecht, then Amsterdam. May 13, 1940, evening. German Commander General Rudolf Schmidt sent an ultimatum to the Dutch command in Rotterdam. The text was crystal clear. If the city did not capitulate by 1:20 p.m. on May 14th, it would be subjected to aerial bombardment. The ultimatum was delivered through envoys under a white flag. Dutch Commander Colonel Peter Charroux received the document and faced an impossible choice. On the one hand, resistance seemed pointless. The Netherlands was surrounded, its army was weaker than the Germans, and no Allied aid was arriving. Surrender would save the city from destruction. On the other hand, surrender would mean betraying a country that was still fighting. Queen Wilhelmina hadn't evacuated, the government was functioning, and other cities were holding out. Charroux decided to buy time. May 14th, morning. Dutch and German officers met for negotiations. The Dutch set conditions: guarantees of safety for the civilian population, the retention of weapons for officers, and an honorable surrender. The Germans insisted on unconditional surrender. The negotiations dragged on, each side trying to buy time or secure better terms. The clock was ticking. 1:20 p.m. was approaching. Meanwhile, the German command was preparing the bombing campaign. Kampfgeschwader 54, KG 54, a bomber squadron based in Germany, received the order to take off. About 100 Heinkel, He-111 bombers were loaded with bombs: 158 250 kilos high explosive bombs and 1,150 50 kilos incendiary bombs. The target was clearly defined: the center of Rotterdam, the area between the bridges over the Maas, and the train station. The order was given by General Albert Kesselring, commander of the 2nd Luftwaffe. Kesselring was a career soldier who carried out orders without sentimentality. He saw the bombing as a military necessity, a way to quickly end the campaign and save the lives of German soldiers. The civilian casualties in Rotterdam were collateral damage, acceptable in the context of the war. Around 12 p.m., the bombers took off from airfields in Germany. They flew in tight formation, heading for Rotterdam. The flight time was about an hour. This meant they would be over the target at around 1 p.m., 20 minutes before the ultimatum expired. The plan was as follows. If the Dutch capitulated by the time they arrived, the bombing would be called off. A signal would be given: red flares from the ground. If no signal was given, the bombers would carry out their mission. 1 p.m. Negotiations were still ongoing. The Dutch demanded additional time to consult with higher command. The Germans agreed to a short delay. Charroux sent a courier to The Hague to receive instructions from the government. But communications were disrupted, the roads were damaged, and the courier was stuck in a traffic jam. There was no response. 13:20. The ultimatum had expired, but negotiations continued. German officers on the ground realized that capitulation was imminent. General Schmidt attempted to call off the bombing. He sent an urgent message to the 2nd Air Fleet headquarters. Call off the raid on Rotterdam. The city is ready to capitulate. But was this message received? Were it relayed to the bomber crews already en route to their target? There are several versions of what happened next. According to one, the cancellation message was received, but too late. The bombers were already over the target and could not be stopped due to the lack of radio contact. Another version suggests the message was deliberately ignored by someone in the chain of command who wanted to teach the Dutch a lesson. A third version suggests the message wasn't sent in time at all. What is known for certain is that on the ground in Rotterdam, German troops attempted to signal an abort: red flares. They launched the flares, but only some of the crews saw them. The sky was overcast, and visibility was poor. Furthermore, the red flares could have been interpreted as anti-aircraft fire. Some crews, upon seeing the flares, turned back without dropping their bombs. But the majority, between 57 and 66 aircraft out of approximately 100, did not see the signal or ignored it. 1:27 p.m. The first bombs fell on Rotterdam. Residents who saw the approaching planes hoped until the very end that it was a training flight or that the bombers would just miss. But their hopes were dashed with the first explosions. The catastrophe had begun. The decision to destroy Rotterdam was not spontaneous. It was a deliberate choice by the German command, based on a specific military logic. To understand this logic, one must look at the situation through the eyes of the German generals in May 1940. Plan Gelb envisioned a rapid capture of the Netherlands in 1 to 2 days, followed by an offensive against France. But by May 13th, the fourth day of the invasion, the Netherlands was still resisting. This created problems. German tank divisions, which were supposed to break through Belgium to France, were bogged down in the battle for Dutch cities. Every day of delay gave the French and British time to mobilize and strengthen their defenses. Rotterdam was a key hub. As long as the Dutch held the northern part of the city, German troops couldn't break through to Fortress Holland. And as long as Fortress Holland held, the Netherlands wouldn't capitulate. The Germans could have taken Rotterdam by storm, but street fighting would have taken days, maybe weeks. German losses would have been high. Time was critical. The alternative to assault was bombing. The Luftwaffe had overwhelming air superiority. The Dutch Air Force had been destroyed in the first days of the war. German bombers could attack any target with impunity. The idea was simple. If it was impossible to capture a city quickly on the ground, it could be destroyed from the air. Destroying the city would break the will to resist and force the capitulation of not only Rotterdam, but the entire country. This idea wasn't new. The theory of strategic bombing had been developed as early as the 1920s and 1930s by Italian General Giulio Douhet, who argued that future wars would be won by air power, destroying enemy cities, decimating their industry and morale. But it wasn't until May 1940 that this theory was tested in practice in Europe. Spain was an exception. In 1937, during the Spanish Civil War, the German Condor Legion destroyed the city of Guernica. It was the first major bombing of a civilian city in Europe. Around 1,600 people died. The international community was shocked. But Franco won the war, and the Germans concluded, "Bombing works. It breaks the will to resist." Rotterdam was intended to become the Netherlands' Guernica. The German command hoped that the destruction of the country's second-largest city would create panic, demoralize the population and government, and force capitulation. Moreover, the threat of the destruction of other cities, Utrecht and Amsterdam, was intended to increase the pressure. The choice of Rotterdam was no accident. It was an important port, an industrial and commercial center. But there were almost no military installations in the city center. The Germans knew this. The bombs would fall on residential areas, shops, churches. This wasn't collateral damage, it was the goal. The idea was to create maximum destruction and maximum psychological impact. Kesselring and other German commanders later claimed they tried to call off the bombing when surrender negotiations began. This may be true. Perhaps they genuinely wanted to avoid unnecessary casualties. But the fact remains. The system was set up in such a way that cancellation was nearly impossible. The bombers had no radio contact with the ground. The cancellation signal, red flares, was primitive and unreliable. This means that once the order to bomb was given, the outcome was almost predetermined. Some historians believe this was intentional, that the German command wanted to destroy Rotterdam no matter what, to teach a lesson not only to the Netherlands, but to other countries as well. German resistance would lead to the destruction of your cities. It was a show of force, terror as a political tool. May 14, 1940, around 12 p.m. At airfields in Germany, the crews of Kampfgeschwader 54, KG 54, were preparing for takeoff. This was the Luftwaffe's elite bomber squadron experienced in combat in Poland. The pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners were all professionals, well-trained and motivated. They received their orders: destroy the center of Rotterdam. Heinkel He-111 bombers were the Luftwaffe's main strike force at the beginning of the war. They were twin-engine medium bombers with a crew of 4 to 5. Their maximum bomb load was approximately 2,000 kilos. Their speed was approximately 400 kilometers h. Their range was approximately 2,000 kilometers. They were armed with several machine guns for self-defense. The He-111 was a reliable and effective aircraft, which performed well in Poland and Norway. Around 90-100 He-111 aircraft were used for the raid on Rotterdam. Each aircraft carried a combination of high-explosive and incendiary bombs. The SC-250 high-explosive bombs, weighing 250 kilos, were designed to destroy buildings. They exploded on impact, creating a powerful shockwave that tore off roofs, collapsed walls, and created rubble. The B-1E incendiary bombs, weighing 50 kilo, were designed to cause fires. They contained thermite or magnesium, which burned at approximately 2,000 degrees C, igniting everything in their vicinity. The tactic was well established. First, high-explosive bombs open up buildings, destroying roofs and walls. Then, incendiary bombs ignite the interior. The fire spreads from building to building, creating massive conflagrations. This was the same tactic that would later be used in Coventry, Dresden, and Tokyo. Rotterdam was a testing ground. The crews received a briefing. They were shown aerial photographs of Rotterdam. The target was clearly marked: a square in the city center, between the bridges over the Maas and the train station. It was the historic center, a densely populated area with narrow streets and old buildings. They were told it was a military installation, that Dutch troops were using these buildings as strongholds. Some crews believed this. Others knew it was a lie, but they carried out their orders. Around 12, the bombers began to take off. One after another, the heavy machines raced along the runway, lifted off, and gained altitude. A column formed, a dense formation of bombers, stretching several kilometers across the sky. It was an impressive and ominous sight: hundreds of combat aircraft, bringing death and destruction. The flight took about an hour. The bombers flew at an altitude of about 2,000–3,000 meters. The weather was variable, overcast, clear in places. Visibility wasn't perfect, but sufficient for bombing. Dutch air defenses were weak. Most anti-aircraft guns had been destroyed in the first days of the war. There were no fighters. The bombers flew with impunity. Around 1:20 p.m., the first bombers appeared over Rotterdam. Residents saw them and ran for shelter. But most didn't have time. No air raid sirens sounded. No one expected a raid. Many were on the streets, in shops, at work. They looked up, saw the planes, and froze in horror, realizing what was about to happen. On the ground, German troops attempted to signal the abort. Officers ran into the open and began firing red flares into the sky. Some pilots saw the flares. The commander of one of the bomber groups, about 30–40 aircraft, decided to turn back without dropping their bombs. These crews returned to base with a full bomb load, having complied with the abort order. But the rest, between 57 and 66 aircraft, didn't see the signal or ignored it. Perhaps cloud cover obscured visibility. Perhaps the pilots interpreted the red flares as anti-aircraft fire. Perhaps someone decided it was best to follow the initial order. Either way, these bombers continued their attack. At 1:27 p.m., they opened their bomb bays and began dropping their bombs. The bombardiers peered through their sights, selected release points, and pressed buttons. The bombs detached from their mounts and fell, picking up speed. After about 10–15 seconds, they reached the ground. The destruction began. May 14, 1940, 1:27 p.m. The first bomb fell in the center of Rotterdam. Then the 2nd, 3rd, 10th, 100th. Over the next 15 minutes, 57 to 66 Heinkel He-111 bombers dropped approximately 97 tons of bombs on an area of approximately 2.5–2.6 square kilometers. It was the most concentrated airstrike Europe had seen to that point. 250-kilogram high-explosive bombs exploded with a deafening roar. Each blast created a shock wave that tore off roofs, collapsed walls, and shattered windows for hundreds of meters around. Buildings that had stood for centuries collapsed in seconds. Bricks, beams, and roof tiles flew in all directions. People caught in the streets were killed by the blasts or crushed by the debris. Thousands of 50-kilogram incendiary bombs fell. They pierced the roofs of destroyed buildings, penetrated, and ignited. Thermite and magnesium burned at temperatures of around 2,000 degrees C, hot enough to ignite wood, brick, and even metal. Within minutes, hundreds of buildings were ablaze. Rotterdam was an old city. Many of the buildings in the center were constructed in the 16th and 17th centuries of wood and brick. They burned quickly and fiercely. The wind intensified the fire. That day, a strong southwesterly wind blew, carrying sparks and flames from building to building, from block to block. The flames leaped across narrow medieval streets, engulfing entire neighborhoods. Fire crews tried to contain the blaze, but it was impossible. There were too many fires, too little water, too much debris on the roads. Fire hoses couldn't reach the tall buildings. The fire spread faster than the firefighters could extinguish it. By evening, the center of Rotterdam was ablaze. The fire was visible for tens of kilometers. Smoke rose into the sky in a column several kilometers high. The heat was so intense that it melted metal. People caught in the fire zone died of suffocation long before the flames reached them. Oxygen burned out, and the air became scorching hot. Breathing was impossible. The areas that were destroyed included the historic center between the Willemsbrug and Maas bridges, the Old Port, the Bospa and Tuus en Dijken shopping districts, and residential areas along the Hoogstraat. A total of 24,978 residential buildings, 2,320 shops, 775 warehouses, 62 schools, and 24 churches were destroyed. The area of destruction was 2.5–2.6 square kilometers, virtually the entire historic center of the city. The human losses were tragic, but could have been significantly higher. Official figures put the death toll at around 800–900. The exact figures range from 814 to 884, depending on the source. Many residents managed to take refuge in basements or flee the city center. Those who found themselves on the streets at the time of the attack had little chance. Explosions, debris, and fire killed instantly. Many bodies were discovered only days later, after the fires had died down and the rubble had been cleared. More than 80,000 of the city's 620,000 residents were left homeless. It was a catastrophic blow. Tens of thousands of people lost everything: homes, property, and livelihoods. Many fled the city, becoming refugees. They fled on foot, carting their remaining belongings, seeking refuge in other cities, with relatives or in refugee camps. The economic losses were enormous. Rotterdam was the Netherlands' largest port, a commercial and industrial center. The destruction of the city center meant the destruction of thousands of businesses, stores, and warehouses. The port continued to function, but trade was paralyzed. The city's economy was devastated. The cultural losses were irreparable. Entire blocks of medieval architecture, dating back to the 15th and 16th centuries, disappeared. Archives, libraries, museums, and churches were destroyed. The Church of St. Lawrence, Groot of St. Lawrenskirk, built between 1449 and 1525, was seriously damaged. Burned out from the inside, its roof collapsed. The town hall, Stadhuis, built between 1914 and 1920, miraculously survived, despite being damaged. These were among the only major historic buildings that remained standing. The psychological impact was devastating. The residents of Rotterdam lived in a peaceful city on the morning of May 14th. By evening, their city was dead. In 15 minutes, everything they knew, everything they loved, was destroyed. Many were in shock, unable to believe what was happening. Some wandered among the ruins, searching for their homes, their loved ones. Others sat on the roadsides, staring into space, unable to comprehend the scale of the catastrophe. The bombing lasted 15 minutes, but the consequences will be felt for decades. When the smoke cleared and the fire began to die down, the scale of the disaster became clear. Rotterdam city center was devastated. The area destroyed covered approximately 2.6 square kilometers. To put that into perspective, that's roughly the size of 250 football fields covered in rubble. Almost the entire historic city center was destroyed. The material losses were colossal. 24,978 homes were destroyed or damaged beyond repair, leaving tens of thousands of families homeless. 2,320 shops, from small stores to large department stores, were destroyed. 775 warehouses burned down, along with their merchandise. 62 schools were destroyed, leaving children unable to attend school. 24 churches were destroyed or damaged, leaving places of worship for centuries in ruins. The total area of destroyed buildings was estimated at approximately 638 acres, about 258 hectares. The cost of damage was estimated at hundreds of millions of guilders, a huge sum for a small country in 1940. Reconstruction would require decades and colossal investments. The human losses, though lower than they might have been, were still tragic. According to official figures, between 800 and 900 people died. The exact figures vary, 814, 850, 884, according to different sources. These figures included those killed directly during the bombing by explosions, debris, and fire, and those who died in the following days from wounds, burns, and suffocation. Why were there relatively few casualties compared to the scale of the destruction? There are several reasons. First, the bombing occurred during the day, around 1:30 p.m., when many people were at work, not at home. Had the raid occurred at night, when everyone was asleep in their homes, the casualties would have been several times higher. Second, many residents managed to take refuge in basements, which protected them from the explosions and fire. Third, some areas of the city center had been evacuated in advance due to the fighting. Nevertheless, each of these 800-900 victims was a tragedy. They were mothers, fathers, children, and the elderly. Many families lost loved ones. Many bodies were never found, burned in fires, or buried under rubble. Some were identified only weeks later. Mass graves were held in the following days. More than 80,000 people were left homeless. It was a humanitarian catastrophe. Tens of thousands needed urgent shelter, food, and medical care. Temporary refugee camps were set up. Churches, schools, and public buildings in undamaged areas were converted into shelters. Families lived in tents, school classrooms, and any available spaces. Many fled the city. They left on foot or in any available transport: bicycles, carts, trucks. The roads out of Rotterdam were clogged with refugees. They carried with them the last of their belongings: suitcases, bags, children. They sought refuge in other cities, with relatives, with friends. Some never returned to Rotterdam. The economic consequences were catastrophic. Rotterdam was the second largest city in the Netherlands and its largest port. Its economy was based on trade, industry, and services. The destruction of the city center meant the destruction of thousands of businesses. Shops, offices, warehouses, banks, everything disappeared. Thousands of people lost their jobs. The city's economy was paralyzed. The port continued to function. It was partially damaged, but not destroyed. The Germans were interested in preserving the port for their own needs and quickly restored critical infrastructure. But trade operations were disrupted. Many companies relocated to other cities or ceased operations. The cultural losses were irreparable. Rotterdam was a city with a rich history, founded in the 13th century. Its center was a model of medieval Dutch architecture: narrow streets, stepped gables, canals, bridges. All of this disappeared in 15 minutes. Future generations will never see the old Rotterdam. Only photographs remain. May 14, 1940, evening. While Rotterdam burned, the Dutch government convened for an emergency meeting in The Hague. Queen Wilhelmina, Prime Minister Dirk Jan de Geer, Minister of War Adriaan Dijksterhuis, and Commander-in-Chief General Hendrik Winkelman discussed the situation. It was catastrophic. Rotterdam lay in ruins. The Germans threatened to destroy Utrecht unless the Netherlands capitulated immediately. Then it would be Amsterdam's turn. The Dutch army fought bravely, but it was doomed. It had no tanks, little artillery, and an outdated air force. The Germans had overwhelming superiority. The Allies, Britain and France, were unable to help. Continuing to resist meant condemning other cities to the same fate as Rotterdam. Winkelman was against capitulation. He wanted to continue fighting, retreat to Fortress Holland, the central fortified region, and hold out until Allied aid arrived. But de Geer and the other ministers understood that help would not come. The British and French were preoccupied with their own problems. The Germans were breaking through Belgium to France. The Netherlands was left to fend for itself. Queen Wilhelmina was a strong woman who refused to give up, but she also understood her responsibility. Continuing the war meant more destruction, more victims. Rotterdam was first. Utrecht would be second. Amsterdam third. How many cities must be sacrificed for the sake of symbolic resistance? The decision was made: capitulate on conditions. But the Queen would not remain. Wilhelmina decided to evacuate to London with the government. From there, she would continue the struggle. Symbolic, political, but still a struggle. The Netherlands would capitulate, but the government in exile would represent a free Holland and be the voice of resistance. On the evening of May 14th, Winkelman sent a telegram to the German command. The Netherlands were ready to discuss surrender terms. The Germans responded: unconditional surrender, no conditions. Winkelman tried to bargain, but the Germans were adamant. They held all the cards. They could destroy the next city at any moment. May 15, 1940, morning. Winkelman signed the instrument of surrender. The Dutch army laid down its arms. The Netherlands ceased resistance. The war that began on May 10th ended on May 15th, 5 days later. It was the shortest German campaign on the Western Front. Poland resisted for a month. France would resist for 6 weeks. The Netherlands held out for 5 days. Why so quickly? There were several reasons. First, Germany's military superiority was overwhelming. The Dutch army had no chance. Second, geography. The Netherlands is a small country. The Germans could reach any city in a matter of hours. Third, the bombing of Rotterdam. This was a psychological shock that broke the will to resist. The threat of further bombing made continuing the war pointless. Queen Wilhelmina evacuated to London on a British destroyer. The Prime Minister and several ministers accompanied her. They established a government in exile, which would function until 1945. From London, Wilhelmina broadcast on BBC radio, calling on the Dutch to resist and bolstering morale. The occupation of the Netherlands began. The Germans established a civil administration headed by Arthur Seyss-Inquart, an Austrian Nazi. The occupation would be brutal. Dutch Jews would be deported to concentration camps. Resistance would be suppressed by executions and repression. The famine of the winter of 1944-1945 would kill approximately 20,000 people. The Netherlands would not be liberated until May 1945, 5 years after the capitulation. For many Dutch, the capitulation was a disgrace. They believed they should have fought to the bitter end. but most understood it was the only sensible solution. Continuing the war meant the destruction of the entire country. Rotterdam demonstrated that the Germans were prepared to destroy cities. Saving lives was more important than symbolic resistance. News of the bombing of Rotterdam spread around the world within hours. Newspapers around the world carried headlines like Rotterdam destroyed, air terror, and Nazi barbarism. Photos of the burning city, ruins, and refugees shocked the international community. It was the first time a major European city had been deliberately destroyed from the air for a political purpose. Britain and France condemned the bombing as a war crime. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain called it an act of barbarity. French President Albert Lebrun expressed deep indignation. American President Franklin Roosevelt, although the United States was not yet involved in the war, also condemned Germany's actions. The international community was shocked. Germany denied the accusations. Official German propaganda claimed the bombing was a military necessity, that Rotterdam was a fortified position, that Dutch troops refused to surrender, and that the city caught fire accidentally due to Dutch artillery. These claims were false, but German propaganda persisted. The bombing of Rotterdam set a precedent. It paved the way for an escalation of the air war. If the Germans could destroy cities, why couldn't the Allies respond in kind? The logic of retaliation was simple and brutal. An eye for an eye, a city for a city. In September 1940, the Luftwaffe began the Blitz, massive bombing raids on British cities. London, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, dozens of cities were targeted. Tens of thousands of civilians died. Britain responded by bombing German cities. The Royal Air Force began night raids on Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne. The war became an all-out war against cities. Rotterdam was the first link in this chain. It was followed by Guernica, although that happened earlier, in 1937 during the Spanish Civil War, Coventry, 1940, London, 1940-1941, Cologne, 1942, Hamburg, 1943, and Dresden, 1945. In the Pacific, Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. The concept of strategic bombing, the destruction of cities to undermine the enemy's morale and industry, became the dominant strategy. Rotterdam also changed the international law of war. Before 1940, the Hague Conventions limited the bombing of civilian targets. Cities without military fortifications were not to be attacked. But Rotterdam demonstrated that these conventions had become mere paper. In total war, all rules are abolished. After the war, during the formation of the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law, the bombing of Rotterdam was one example that led to the creation of rules for the protection of civilians. But these rules also proved insufficient. The wars of the second half of the 20th century, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, demonstrated that cities continue to be targets. For the Netherlands, the bombing of Rotterdam was a national trauma. It was the moment when the country realized its neutrality no longer protected it. That in modern warfare, small countries are defenseless against great powers. That a city could be destroyed in 15 minutes, with no one coming to its aid. After the war, reconstruction began. Rotterdam lay in ruins. The city center was dead. 2.5 square kilometers. Ash, rubble, emptiness. The question arose, restore the old city or build a new one? A radical decision was made. Build a new one. The old buildings were not restored. The ruins were completely dismantled. The rubble was removed. Underground utilities were dismantled. The city center was cleared to the ground. This was a conscious decision, not to try to recreate the past, but to create the future. Rotterdam was to become a symbol of modernism, a 21st century city. Just 4 days after the bombing, on May 18, 1940, still under German occupation, architect Willem Gerrits Witteveen received the commission to develop a reconstruction plan. German Reich Commissioner Arthur Seyss-Inquart envisioned Rotterdam as the future German metropolis and the empire's main port. He wanted to create a city for 2 million residents, compared to 620,000 in 1940. Witteveen's plan was ambitious. It envisioned a complete redesign of the city center, wide avenues in place of the narrow medieval streets, open squares, high-rise buildings, and clear zoning, residential areas, a business center, a shopping area, and a port. Medieval chaos was to be replaced by rational order. It was a triumph of modernism. But full implementation of the plan was delayed until the end of the war. In 1945, after liberation, work resumed. The plan was adjusted to reflect new realities. Emphasis was placed on port facilities. Rotterdam was to regain its status as Europe's largest port. By 1950, the port was fully restored and once again became one of the most efficient in the world. The city center was slower to recover. 12 years after the war, in 1957, the central part was still largely empty. Construction proceeded gradually. New buildings were erected in the functionalist style, simple geometric shapes, concrete, glass, and no embellishments. Old Rotterdam, with its stepped gables and narrow streets, disappeared forever. The reconstruction lasted for about 40 years. It wasn't until the 1980s that Rotterdam acquired its modern appearance. Today, it's a city of cutting-edge architecture. Piet Blum's cubic buildings, the Erasmus Bridge, the De Rotterdam skyscrapers, and the Markthal Market Hall. Rotterdam has become the architectural capital of the Netherlands, a city that looks to the future, not the past. But the memory of May 14th lives on. Every year on this day, memorial ceremonies are held. At 1:27 p.m., the moment the first bomb fell, a siren sounds, and the entire city observes a moment of silence. People stop in the streets, leave stores, and stop their cars. A moment of silence in memory of those who perished. In the city center stands the De Verwoeste Stad monument by sculptor Ossip Zadkine. It's a 6.5-meter tall bronze sculpture depicting a man with a hole in his heart. His arms are raised to the sky in a silent scream. This is the cry of Rotterdam, a city that lost its heart in 15 minutes. The sculpture was erected in 1953 and has become a symbol of the city. The bombing of Rotterdam changed the city forever. Old Rotterdam disappeared. New Rotterdam, modernist, functional, and forward-looking, rose from the ashes. Some lament the loss of its historical heritage. Others are proud that the city was able to regenerate and become a symbol of renewal. May 14, 1940, is a lesson in how quickly history can change. 15 minutes. That's all it took to destroy a city that had existed for 600 years. 15 minutes that decided the fate not only of Rotterdam, but of the entire Netherlands. 15 minutes that ushered in a new era of warfare, an era when cities became battlefields, when civilians became targets, when destruction from the air became the norm. Sometimes history breaks not in long campaigns, but in a brief flash. Rotterdam was such a flash, the moment when the world realized that war had changed forever.